Stockholm, 1661. A cold morning inside a stone building and a line of people who don't quite trust each other anymore. Near the front of that line stands a merchant holding a square of paper in his fist. It doesn't look like money. It's thin, it's light. You could fold it and put it in a coat pocket without feeling the weight at all. 3 years ago, nobody in this city would have taken that paper in exchange for a loaf of bread. Today, the man just ahead of him hands over the exact same kind of paper and walks out the door with a sack of silver coin under his arm. The man behind him is already starting to shout, and behind the counter, a clerk named Johan Palmstruch is running numbers in his head that are not going to end well for him. Sweden's money until recently was copper. Not coins. Some of those copper plates weighed more than a newborn child. Buying a pig meant loading a cart, not filling a pocket. Palmstruch had solved that problem. He'd solved it so completely, so successfully, that people had stopped wanting the copper back at all. Paper was easier. Paper was lighter. Paper was better in every single way that mattered to a person standing in a market with their arms full. Except for one thing. He'd printed more of these paper promises than his vaults actually had metal to redeem. Everybody in that room can feel it before anyone says it out loud. The way a crowd goes quiet right before it doesn't something. Money is supposed to be the boring part of life, the part you don't think about. The moment it stops being boring is the moment something underneath it has already started to give way. Here's the part that catches almost everyone off guard walking into the story. Banking did not begin with a banker. It didn't start in a counting house in Renaissance Florence or in a wood-paneled office somewhere in the city of London or in any building whose name you'd recognize today. It began with priests. 5,000 years before Johan Palmstruch ever pressed a single sheet of paper into a customer's hand. In mud brick temples sitting on a floodplain between two rivers, in a stretch of land that's now Iraq. And the road from that temple to this exact counter in Stockholm is one long 5,000-year argument circling one question that never actually gets resolved. Who do you trust with your money when you can't stand there and watch it yourself? So before we find out exactly how badly this ends for Palmstruch, rewind the whole thing, all the way back to the beginning. Because the very first bank on Earth wasn't a bank at all. It was a god's warehouse, and the man running it wasn't a banker. He was a priest with a very long memory problem. Uruk, Eridu, somewhere around 3500 BC. In these cities, the temple isn't part of the economy. It is the economy. It owns the farmland stretching out past the walls. It owns the livestock grazing on that land. It runs the workshops where craftsmen turn raw material into finished goods. Farmers haul their surplus grain into temple granaries after every harvest, and they're not doing it out of devotion alone. A granary run by priests is simply safer than a hut that can burn down overnight or get robbed while the family sleeps. Craftsmen deliver their output as offerings and as taxes, funneling straight into the same storerooms. And the men running those storerooms, the same men conducting the religious rites, chanting to the gods one moment and counting sacks of barley the next, become, almost by accident, the world's first accountants. Every sack that goes in gets tracked. Every sack that comes back out gets tracked too. Nobody in Uruk dared steal from a god's warehouse. That fear alone did more protective work than any lock or wall ever could have. But fear only gets you so far. As these temple economies keep growing, city after city, harvest after harvest, one problem starts to outpace even the most devoted priest's memory. How do you track thousands of individual transactions across an entire city when no human brain is built to hold that much detail? The answer isn't some flash of genius from a visionary. It's a shortcut invented by scribes trying to avoid tedious work. They start using small clay tokens, each one shaped to represent a specific good, livestock, grain, oil, cloth, and sealing a handful of relevant tokens inside a hollow clay envelope called a bulla, as proof that a deal had actually been made. That worked fine, except for one enormous inconvenience. Every single time someone needed to verify what was inside, they had to crack the envelope open, destroying the record they were trying to check. So scribes start doing something simpler. Instead of breaking the seal, they press the tokens on the wet clay on the outside of the envelope before it hardens, leaving an impression that anyone could read without ever cracking it open. Those impressions, made purely so bored temple accountants could save themselves a chore, start to simplify over time into abstract symbols, and those symbols, refined generation after generation, become cuneiform. A great many historians believe that writing itself, quite possibly humanity's single greatest invention, exists specifically because temple bookkeepers in ancient Mesopotamia needed better record-keeping. Not because a poet somewhere needed a way to preserve a verse, because an accountant needed to stop breaking open envelopes. Grain, meanwhile, becomes the world's very first savings account. It didn't earn interest sitting inside a temple granary the way a modern deposit would, but it also didn't rot the way it would sitting in a farmer's house, and it didn't attract thieves the way loose grain scattered around a home would. Workers got paid in it, governments taxed in it, merchants traded in it. When a harvest failed somewhere in the region, the temple's stored reserves were the only thing standing between that city and outright starvation. But grain has one enormous weakness baked directly into what it is, and that weakness is about to reshape the entire story. Grain is heavy, grain spoils, and grain is completely useless to a merchant standing 3 cities away who needs to pay for something right now, today, without hauling sacks of barley across a desert. Somewhere around 2900 to 2500 BC, traders start turning to silver instead, rings of it, cut-off fragments, cast ingots, for anything that has to travel far or move quickly. There are no coins yet. None. Every single transaction means pulling out a set of balance scales on the spot and weighing the metal by hand, sometimes with a temple official standing there to certify the purity before the deal is done. People carried scales the way we carry wallets today. Silver held its value in a way grain simply couldn't, and merchants who managed to accumulate enough of it could suddenly finance trading expeditions that a pile of barley never would have paid for. Once silver starts changing hands regularly across the region, one development becomes almost impossible to avoid: lending. By around 2600 BC, temples and independent merchants across Mesopotamia are routinely issuing loans of grain, silver, livestock, and seed to be repaid once the harvest comes or once a caravan finally returns from its trip. Grain loans carry noticeably higher interest than silver loans do. Contracts spell out exact repayment dates and specific penalties for default, and witnesses sign off on the deal to prevent one party from lying about the terms later. Charging interest wasn't dreamed up by some sharp-suited modern bankers sitting behind a mahogany desk. It was already routine, everyday business practice nearly 4,600 years ago, carved in wet clay by scribes who assumed, correctly, that people would eventually try to weasel out of what they owed. And wherever lending shows up, a professional lender eventually shows up right behind it. Except this particular lender doesn't sit behind a desk, he rides a donkey across hundreds of miles of open country. Around 2350 BC, a class of merchant called the Tamkarum starts appearing throughout Mesopotamia. These are men who physically travel with goods across enormous distances, but who also arrange loans on the side, finance entire caravans, and invest other people's silver on their behalf. Wealthy families entrust their capital to a Tamkarum in almost exactly the same way an investor today entrusts capital to a fund manager they've never personally met, managing money on the other side of the world. Some of them pull funds from several different backers at once and split the profits according to what each person put in. No permanent building, no marble entrance, nothing resembling what you'd point at today and immediately call a bank. So what actually convinced a wealthy family to hand over their silver to a man who spent half the year traveling with a donkey caravan through bandit country? Reputation. That's the entire mechanism, and nothing more sophisticated than that. Their success as a class of merchant financier proved something that the old temple economies had never had to prove before. Finance didn't need a god's roof standing under it in order to function. It could live entirely inside one man's name, passed from client to client by word of mouth. The state took notice fast. Under the third dynasty of around 2100 BC, the government constructs one of the most sophisticated bureaucracies the ancient world had ever produced. Tens of thousands of individual clay tablets, tracking taxes, wages, inventories, loans, and transfers, all of it periodically audited by officials sent out specifically to check the books kept by local administrators. 4,000 years before a single modern office worker ever complained about a spreadsheet, an entire kingdom was already drowning in paperwork. It just happened to be paperwork made of fired clay instead of printed paper. By 1900 BC, private merchant families across Mesopotamia had begun handling deposits and loans entirely on their own, completely outside the temple system, competing directly with the gods on reputation and reputation alone. The wall separating religious finance from private finance already had a crack running through it, and a king was about to widen that crack with a piece of legislation that most people remember today for entirely the wrong reason. 1754. King Hammurabi. Everyone alive today knows him for one specific phrase, an eye for an eye, carved permanently on stone. Almost nobody associates him with what's sitting quietly in that same legal code, right alongside it. Buried in among the punishments and the proclamations are dozens of laws that don't read anything like ancient religious scripture. They read like modern banking regulation drafted by a committee. Maximum interest rates spelled out precisely by loan type. Rules covering what happens when property left in a merchant's care gets lost through simple negligence. Legal protections built specifically for borrowers whose crops failed through no fault of their own. Written contracts, fully enforceable in a court of law. 3,800 years ago, a government was already legislating interest rate caps and basic consumer protection, the exact same fight that regulators and lenders are still having today, just conducted with different paperwork and no clay tablets involved. While Hammurabi was carving banking regulation into stone, Egypt was quietly building an entirely different kind of financial system a few miles away. And out on the open Mediterranean, a completely separate group of traders was solving a problem that had nothing to do with the law at all. It had to do with pirates. Egypt, roughly 1600 to 1200 BC. The state runs enormous granaries filled through taxation, issuing formal receipts for deposits that could, in some cases, actually be transferred between different people, functioning simultaneously as a treasury, an emergency reserve, and the national warehouse all rolled into a single system. It feeds soldiers on campaign. It feeds laborers on state projects. It stabilizes the entire kingdom through years of famine that would otherwise have caused mass starvation. Meanwhile, out on the water, between 1200 and 900 BC, Phoenician traders built something considerably looser and more informal, an unofficial credit network stretched across dozens of ports scattered along the coastline. Carrying enough silver aboard a ship to cover an entire voyage was basically an open invitation to get robbed at sea by the first pirate crew who noticed the cargo. So how exactly do you finance a trading network stretched across a coastline, crawling with people who would happily take your silver and your ship? You simply stop carrying the silver in the first place. Merchant families extend credit to people they've come to trust over years of repeated dealing and settle the actual books later, port by port, season by season. No banks exist yet in any formal sense, just relationships repeated enough times and reliably enough that they function like a signature and a seal. By the time Greek civilization begins rising, from roughly 800 to 650 BC, wealthy people across the region find an entirely new place to park their fortunes, one guarded not by soldiers standing at the door, but by fear of what the gods themselves might do to a thief. Delphi, Olympia, sanctuaries considered so sacred that robbing them was simply unthinkable to anyone raised in that world. Kings, entire cities, and private citizens deposit valuables inside these temples for safekeeping, trusting divine retribution far more than they'd ever trust a lock bolted to a door. And then, somewhere between 650 and 600 BC, in the kingdom of Lydia in western Anatolia, someone does something so small and so simple that it barely even sounds like an invention at all. A small metal disc, a stamp pressed into it, electrum, a naturally occurring gold-silver alloy standardized under royal authority so that people no longer need to weigh out silver by hand for every single transaction they make. That's the entire invention. That's all of it. And yet within a single century, this one stamped disc gives rise to a brand new profession showing up in Greek marketplaces, a profession that will go on to become the first recognizable bank the world had ever actually seen. Banks didn't appear because someone finally sat down and invented banking as an idea. They appeared because someone finally invented a form of money people could trust on sight without a scale in hand. Athens, sometime around 600 to 575 BC. Dozens of Greek city-states are minting their own coins now, and every single one has a different weight, a different purity, a different design stamped into the metal. Right in the middle of that mess, a man sits down behind a small table. A trader walks into the crowded Athenian agora carrying coins from Corinth in his purse, and absolutely nobody in the market wants to touch them. The man behind the small table, the trapeza, starts weighing and inspecting coins for a modest fee, spotting the ones that have been clipped, the outright fakes, the underweight pieces, exchanging one city's coin for another's on the spot. People start calling him a trapezetes, literally tableman. One of history's most consequential financial industries began with nothing more elaborate than one man and one table set up in a crowded market square. It didn't stay that simple for long. Merchants who trust a tableman to correctly tell real silver from fake start leaving their coins with him entirely, rather than dragging heavy bags of it through streets full of opportunistic thieves. He gives them a written record and promises to hand the coin back whenever they ask for it. Fine so far and useful. But then somebody notices something that quietly changes the shape of finance forever, and nobody bothered writing down exactly who first figured it out or when. Not every single depositor comes back demanding their money on the exact same day, which means a banker could lend out a portion of what's sitting in his strongbox, keep just enough on hand to cover whatever withdrawals actually show up in practice, and quietly pocket the interest difference for himself. There was no economic theory behind any of this yet. No textbook had coined the name for it. It was purely a hunch that happened to work in practice. And it is the exact same hunch that every single bank on Earth is still operating on today, 25 centuries later, dressed up in far more sophisticated language. And once that hunch takes hold across the market, the private bankers of Athens realize their real fortune isn't sitting in guarding coins at all. It's in betting on ships. And some of those particular bets look a lot closer to pure gambling than anything you'd expect to find inside a bank. As Mediterranean trade keeps expanding outward, merchants increasingly need money up front, before they've even set sail, in order to buy the cargo they intend to sell somewhere else entirely. Bankers step in and start financing entire voyages directly. Olive oil, wine, metal, timber, pottery, collecting both interest and profit once the ship finally comes home loaded with goods. Around 500 BC, Greek bankers invent something called the Maritime loan, and the obvious question hanging over the whole arrangement is simple. What actually happens to the debt if the ship never makes it home at all? It vanishes completely. Pirates, storms, wrecked cargo on some unfamiliar coastline. If any of that happens, the borrower owes absolutely nothing, and the lender simply loses everything he put into the voyage. In exchange for shouldering that level of risk, the interest earned on a successful voyage could be enormous. Picture a modern banker agreeing up front that if your ship goes down, you owe him nothing at all. And you start to understand exactly how much of ancient Greek banking looked less like a bank and more like a wager placed across a gaming table. By the mid-400s BC, Greek banking had picked up a trick that feels startlingly modern even now, one that erased the need to physically move a single coin at all. Instead of hauling coins across the entire city by hand just to settle a debt, a customer could simply tell his banker to debit one account and credit another. No coins move at all in this transaction. Only the written record moves. People were making genuinely cashless payments nearly 2,500 years before anyone had a phone sitting in their pocket to do it with a tap. And then the wars arrive. The Persian Wars, followed by decades of Athenian expansion, pouring tribute money and military spending straight through the local economy. More silver circulating through the city than ever before, more work piling up for money changers, more demand for somewhere genuinely safe to park wealth while armies march past the walls. Conflict, despite absolutely everything it destroys along the way, keeps turning out to be an unexpected engine of financial growth, a pattern this entire story is only just getting started with. And right in the middle of that expansion, one of the most remarkable figures in this whole 5,000-year story starts life owning absolutely nothing, not even himself. Pasion, a slave, working inside an Athenian bank sometime around 430 to 400 BC. He turns out to be so capable, so relentlessly, scrupulously honest with every client's money that his owners eventually decide to free him outright. He goes on to buy the bank outright and builds it into one of the most successful financial institutions in the entire city, taking deposits, exchanging currency, financing trade, lending to both merchants and to governments who needed capital. His reputation for honesty becomes so complete, so widely trusted, that Athens grants him full citizenship, an almost unthinkable honor for a man who had once been owned by someone else. He goes on from there to finance shipbuilding and public works across the city. One of history's greatest bankers began life as another man's property and ended it as one of the wealthiest men in the very city that had once owned him outright. But no financial system, however well built, is immune to defeat forever. In 404 BC, Athens loses the Peloponnesian War outright, and every banker in the city is suddenly about to find out exactly how much stress their entire system can actually absorb. Trade contracts sharply. Uncertainty spreads through every marketplace in the city. Borrowers everywhere start struggling to pay back what they owe. Some bankers absorbed real, painful losses that wipe out years of steady profit. This is the exact moment a financial system either shatters completely or somehow manages to hold together. Which one actually happens here? It bends. It doesn't break. The system absorbs the shock without collapsing entirely. The first documented banking stress test in recorded history arrives more than 2,000 years before anyone bothers coining the phrase financial crisis to describe it. And not long afterward, one conqueror is about to trigger a monetary explosion that nobody standing in that stressed Athenian market could possibly have predicted. Between 338 and 323 BC, Alexander the Great tears through the entire Persian Empire and finds centuries worth of gold and silver sitting locked away untouched inside Persian royal vaults. He melts it all down, mints it into millions of individual coins, releases every bit of it all at once straight into Mediterranean commerce. What actually happens to an economy when centuries of buried hoarded treasure gets dumped into circulation practically overnight? An explosion in the total money supply that accelerates trade across the entire region, expands banking dramatically, and connects currencies from Greece to Egypt to Persia into one single interlinked economy for the first time. One conqueror unlocks centuries of buried wealth and almost entirely by accident triggers one of the largest monetary expansions the ancient world had ever witnessed. Egypt, meanwhile, takes a completely different path of its own. Under the Ptolemaic dynasty around 300 BC, the kingdom builds something startlingly close to a modern branch banking network. Royal banks scattered across the entire country, all reporting back to central administrators using standardized records that could be cross-checked against one another. Ordinary citizens pay their taxes directly through a bank counter in person, more than 2,200 years ago. By the 2nd century BC, private bankers, temple treasuries, and formal state banking are all running side by side across the Mediterranean, each one filling a slightly different need. Within just 4 centuries, a man sitting behind the wooden table had become an entire industry holding up a civilization's economy, and the next empire to rise isn't going to invent anything genuinely new at all. It's going to take everything Greece figured out and scale it up to a size Greece never came close to imagining: Rome. As Roman armies gradually swallow the Greek world whole, Roman money changers known as argentarii inherit every single trick the Greek trapezitai had spent centuries carefully developing. But Rome's economy dwarfs anything Greece had ever managed to produce. Senators, landowners, merchants, and ordinary citizens alike all leaning on professional finance as a completely normal part of daily life. Where does an empire of this size actually put its financial district? Right in the middle of everything that matters. The Roman Forum wasn't only the place where senators argued policy and priests conducted sacrifices. It becomes, functionally, Rome's financial district. Bankers set up their offices near the courts and near the markets, close enough that a contract could be enforced the very same afternoon it was signed. Ancient Rome had something remarkably close to a modern Wall Street, just surrounded by temples and senators instead of glass towers. And by around 150 BC, Roman bankers go fully cashless too, the exact same trick the Greeks had discovered generations earlier, now running at a scale the Greeks had never come close to touching. A customer simply instructs his banker to debit one account and credit another, every bit of it recorded carefully in the banker's ledgers. No physical coin ever changes hands at all. Merchants moved enormous sums this way without ever risking a robbery out on the open road. People in ancient Rome were paying each other electronically, more or less, nearly 2,000 years before an actual electron ever entered the picture. Even Rome's auctions run entirely on bank credit, argentaries standing right beside the auction platform extending short-term financing to buyers who happen not to have coins sitting in hand that particular day. Ancient auction houses had their own financing desks thousands of years before any modern auction company ever thought to open one of its own. But finance in Rome was tied tightly and dangerously to Roman politics, and Roman politics had a well-established habit of catching fire without warning. In 88 BC, civil war breaks out between Sulla and Marius. That's the first real tremor running through the system. The next one very nearly takes the entire credit system down with it completely.
Trade slows sharply. Borrowers default across the board. Property values swing wildly because nobody can agree anymore on what anything is genuinely worth. The system survives that particular shock, but only by the narrowest possible margin. Then, in 49 BC, as Julius Caesar and Pompey move steadily toward open civil war, real panic tears through Roman markets. Lenders demand immediate repayment on everything they've ever lent out, while simultaneously refusing to issue a single new loan to anyone. Everyone wants hard cash at exactly the same moment, and property prices collapse under the resulting stampede. Caesar understands something that a lot of generals standing in his exact position might have completely missed. Winning the war outright won't matter one bit if the entire economy dies underneath him first. So what does he actually do about a financial system on the verge of total collapse? He doesn't cancel debts outright, a move that would have instantly wiped out creditors and shattered trust across an entire generation. Instead, he orders that outstanding debts be valued using pre-war property prices, which stops the worst of the panic selling from wiping borrowers out completely. A careful, deliberately surgical intervention. Julius Caesar wasn't only fighting a civil war on the battlefield, he was simultaneously fighting to stop a financial one from tearing Rome apart from the inside. 62 years later, Rome faces its single worst banking panic yet, and this time, an actual emperor has to step in and bail out the entire system himself. AD 33. Under Tiberius, an earlier attempt to strictly enforce old lending regulations backfires badly, triggering a sudden and severe contraction in available credit across the empire. Lenders call in every outstanding loan all at once. Borrowers rush to sell off land just to raise enough cash to cover what they owe. Land prices crash hard. Public confidence evaporates almost overnight. So what does a Roman emperor actually do when the entire credit system seizes up all at once, right in front of him? He floods the system with cash. Tiberius orders the imperial treasury to hand out massive interest-free loans, 100 million sesterces, according to the ancient account, distributed through trusted intermediaries, purely to get liquidity flowing back through the economy again. It works. Confidence returns. Lending activity revives across the board. Nearly 2,000 years before central banks existed as a concept anyone had articulated, Rome had already worked out that the fastest way to stop a banking panic dead in its tracks is to drown it in emergency cash. Not every emperor after Tiberius handles money quite this carefully, though. Under Nero, a small crack starts forming in the currency itself, one that Rome will keep returning to again and again, each time a little more desperately than the last. Between AD 54 and 68, the government quietly reduces the gold and silver content actually contained in Roman coins, officially framed as a way to stretch state finances further. In practice, ordinary people slowly start to notice that their coins are worth a good deal less than they used to be.
Bankers start scrutinizing every single coin that crosses their table, carefully sorting the older, pure issues from the newer, noticeably thinner ones. What starts out as a convenient shortcut has an unfortunate habit of curdling into something worse over time. Debasing the currency in order to solve a short-term budget problem. Small the first time it happens, Rome will do it again and again, and each round gets a little worse than the last. And then, in 193, Rome does something so strange it's genuinely difficult to believe actually happened. After the assassination of Emperor Pertinax, the Praetorian Guard literally auctions off the entire Roman Empire to whoever will pay the most for it.
A wealthy senator named Didius Julianus wins that grim auction outright by promising the soldiers enormous cash payments he then actually has to go raise from somewhere real. So exactly how long does an emperor who bought his own throne actually manage to hold on to it? A few weeks, that's it. He's overthrown almost immediately, straining the imperial treasury badly and rattling confidence in imperial finance on his way out the door. Try to picture the scene properly. An entire empire sold off at auction like livestock, and the eventual winner needing to arrange financing just to actually cover his own winning bid. That entire episode turns out to be only a preview. Between AD 335 and 284, Rome doesn't just wobble unsteadily. It very nearly comes apart at the seams altogether. The crisis of the 3rd century, civil wars overlapping with foreign invasions, overlapping with plague, and a dizzying rapid parade of emperors rising and falling in quick succession. To pay for endless grinding military campaigns, one emperor after another debases the coinage even further than the last one did, shrinking the actual silver content down to a bare sliver of what it used to contain. Inflation soars out of control, trade shrinks dramatically, long-term lending becomes far too risky for anyone sensible to bother with anymore. Is there actually any policy left that can put this economy back together again? In AD 301, Emperor Diocletian tries something genuinely drastic, an edict on maximum prices, legally capping exactly what merchants are allowed to charge for hundreds of specific goods, under threat of severe punishment for anyone who breaks it. It fails almost immediately. The underlying shortages driving the inflation never actually go away, so traders simply pull their goods off the open market entirely rather than sell at a mandated loss. Black markets spring up everywhere enforcement can't reach. Rome tried to defeat inflation by making high prices illegal by decree. It was never going to work, and it didn't. What finally does stabilize things isn't the law at all. It's a single, well-made coin. Constantine, ruling from AD 312 to 337, introduces the gold solidus, a coin struck with such consistent weight and such reliable purity that it never gets quietly shaven down the way everything did under Nero and under the 3rd century emperors before it. Merchants right across the Mediterranean accept it without a moment's hesitation. So how long does one carefully made coin actually manage to hold its value? More than 700 years, it becomes the entire backbone of Byzantine finance for centuries afterward, standing as proof that restoring genuine confidence in a currency alone could revive an entire economy, even after decades of self-inflicted damage stretching back generations. But the western half of the empire doesn't get to enjoy that stability for very long at all. In AD 476, the last Western Roman emperor is deposed outright, and Europe's advanced banking system is about to suffer a setback that lasts for several hundred years afterward. Cities across the West shrink noticeably. Long-distance commerce declines sharply. Professional bankers, one by one, simply stop existing at all, as economic activity turns local, small, and inward-facing. The eastern half of the empire, meanwhile, holds on to those Roman financial traditions for centuries longer. It's going to take hundreds of years for anyone in the West to rebuild what was lost during that collapse. Who eventually manages to actually pull it off? Italy. By the early 1200s, merchant families in Florence, Siena, Genoa, and Venice start building permanent banking houses instead of temporary stalls set up fresh in the market each morning.
A merchant could now deposit money in one city and use that same family's network of connections to settle a transaction somewhere else entirely, without ever moving a single coin across a distance. For the first time in this whole story, banks start becoming institutions that genuinely outlive the individual people who founded them. Not one man's table, but an entire family's name, trusted continent-wide. Around this same period, a merchant's son from Pisa is about to hand European finance a tool it desperately needed and didn't even fully realize was missing. Leonardo of Pisa, far better known to history as Fibonacci, publishes a book called Liber Abaci, formally introducing Europe to Hindu-Arabic numerals he'd personally learned from Arab scholars during his time in North Africa. Roman numerals had made multiplication, division, and everyday bookkeeping a genuine ongoing chore for anyone running a business. Does a shift in something as basic as the number system actually change how an entire industry operates? Eventually, yes, although it takes generations for the new system to fully catch on across the continent. Currency conversion, interest calculation, running a ledger without a splitting headache at the end of the day, all of it becomes dramatically simpler. Modern banking, as it turns out, owes just as much to better mathematics as it does to money itself. And right around this same period, Italian bankers hand Europe something even more consequential, a single piece of paper that fundamentally changes how money moves across an entire continent. Between roughly 1225 and 1250, they refine an instrument known as the Bill of Exchange. Instead of physically hauling a chest of gold along dangerous roads from Florence all the way to Paris, a merchant could simply buy a document instead, a promise, redeemable for coin, honored by a partner banker waiting in a distant city, at an agreed exchange rate and an agreed date. It even offered a quiet workaround for the era's religious restrictions on charging interest outright, since profit could simply be folded into the currency conversion instead of stated openly. International business stops depending on wagons full of gold rolling slowly down dangerous roads. What does it start depending on instead? A piece of paper that people trusted more than they trusted the gold itself. Florence backs all of this with a coin of its own, in 1252, the gold florin, minted pure and kept consistent, at a time when plenty of European rulers were quietly debasing their own currencies the exact same way Nero once had. Merchants right across the continent accept the florin without a second thought. Florentine bankers use it as the standard for major international deals of every kind. One city's gold coin becomes the closest thing medieval Europe has to a genuine global reserve currency. Siena, meanwhile, is busy building something even bigger than Florence's coin, and it's about to collapse in the most spectacular fashion Europe has seen since the fall of Rome itself. King Edward III of England borrows heavily from both banking houses to help finance the opening stages of the Hundred Years' War against France. Hundreds of staff working across both institutions, sophisticated accounting systems, reach stretching into nearly every major commercial center in Western Europe. So what actually happens when the king who owes you nearly everything simply can't pay it back? He can't pay it back. When Edward struggles to make good on his enormous debt, both banks suffer devastating financial losses that neither one fully recovers from. Historians still argue over exactly how much of the blame belongs to Edward personally versus broader economic pressures pressing on the whole continent at the time. But there's no serious argument left that his default played a major role in what followed. One king's repayment problems helped bring down two of Europe's largest banks in one stroke, one of history's earliest sovereign debt crises involving major international finance on this scale. And then something far worse than any single king arrives to finish the job. Between 1348 and 1351, the Black Death kills somewhere between a third and a half of Europe's entire population. Trade slows to almost nothing across the continent. Borrowers die by the thousands, often with no heirs left behind to settle their debts. Entire business partnerships simply cease to exist because the partners themselves are gone. Some banking houses fail outright in the chaos that follows. The ones that do manage to survive don't survive purely by luck. What do they actually have to change about how they operate in order to keep existing at all? They consolidate. They become far more selective, far more cautious about exactly who they choose to lend to going forward. Labor shortages eventually push wages upward across the region and quietly reshape how ordinary people invest and spend their money. The single greatest pandemic of the medieval world forces the banks that survive it to fundamentally reinvent themselves just to keep the lights on. And out of that specific wreckage comes the family that will go on to define an entire century of European finance. In 1397, Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici founds the Medici Bank in Florence, built from the ground up around one hard lesson every collapsed bank before it had somehow failed to learn. Unlike the reckless financial giants that came before them, the Medici build their entire business around caution, diversified clients spread across different regions, strong internal controls, and branches operating in Rome, Venice, Geneva, Bruges, and London simultaneously. They serve merchants, nobles, and especially the papacy, all while carefully avoiding the exact single client dependency that had killed the Grand Tavola outright and crippled both the Bardi and the Peruzzi before them. What does that kind of discipline actually turn into over time? Within just a few decades, one of the wealthiest, most politically powerful families anywhere in Europe. Genoa, meanwhile, takes an entirely different route of its own. In 1407, the Republic founds the Banco di San Giorgio, not a private family venture at all, but a public institution built specifically to manage the city's own government debt. It develops a reputation for careful professionalism that outlasts individual rulers and individual crises alike, and some historians consider it one of the earliest public banks genuinely resembling a modern state financial institution. One of the world's oldest banks began, quite simply, as a government's practical solution to its own debt problem. By the second half of the 1400s, the Medici Bank sits at the absolute center of European finance, and their money is about to fund something far bigger than any single bank statement could ever capture. Managing papal revenue across the continent, financing international trade routes, exchanging currency through a branch network that spans the entire continent. Their financial wealth translates directly into political power, making the Medici the de facto rulers of Florence and everything but formal title. And their money goes on to fund Michelangelo, Botticelli, an entire artistic explosion that still carries their family's era as its permanent name. Can a bank really be responsible for something on that scale? This one is. A bank didn't just make its owners fabulously rich, it helped fund an entire cultural rebirth that's still studied today. By 1500, though, an entirely new family overtakes even the Medici at the very top. Jacob Fugger, known in his own lifetime as Jacob Fugger the Rich, and about to help decide who rules an entire empire. Fugger builds a sprawling German banking dynasty that combines finance directly with mining, trade, and manufacturing, controlling silver and copper mines outright instead of merely financing other people's ventures from a distance. Branches operating across the Holy Roman Empire, Italy, Spain, and well beyond. Loans extended to emperors, kings, and popes alike. By the time he dies in 1525, he's likely the richest private businessman in the whole of European history, relative to the size of the economy in his era. In 1519, does that kind of concentrated wealth actually decide the outcome of an election? When Charles of Habsburg competes directly against Francis I of France for the title of Holy Roman Emperor, the entire outcome hinges on securing the votes of a small handful of prince-electors, and Jacob Fugger finances much of Charles's campaign through enormous loans that pay for the diplomacy and the persuasion needed to actually win those votes. Charles wins and becomes Emperor Charles V. In return, the Fugger family receives mining rights and commercial privileges that make them even richer than before. Historians will probably always debate exactly how much of that election came down to Fugger's money versus raw political maneuvering on its own, but nobody seriously disputes that the financing genuinely mattered to the result. Finance is also starting to change shape entirely around this time, and it's about to stop depending on any single wealthy man at all, no matter how rich. In 1553, England charters the Muscovy Company, its first major joint stock trading venture of any real size. Not a bank at all, a trading company, but it introduces something banking itself would go on to lean on for centuries afterward. Multiple investors pooling their capital together, sharing both the eventual profit and the risk, instead of one single wealthy merchant betting absolutely everything alone on one voyage. What does putting all these financial professionals in one physical place actually accelerate? In 1571, Sir Thomas Gresham opens London's Royal Exchange, giving merchants, bankers, insurers, and money changers a permanent place to conduct business face-to-face every single day of the week. Not a bank either, technically, but concentrating that many financial professionals under one roof speeds up innovation in banking, insurance, and credit all at once, and it marks the true beginning of London's long transformation into a genuine global financial capital. Then, in 1602, one single company does something no company anywhere has ever done before, and modern corporate capital markets are effectively born standing right next to modern banking itself. The Dutch East India Company issues freely tradable shares directly to the general public for the very first time. An investor can now buy a piece of the company and later sell that exact piece again without ever dissolving the underlying business itself. Banks step in almost immediately to settle payments and extend credit against those newly tradable shares. Thousands of ordinary investors pile in at once. What actually happens to a city that suddenly becomes the center of gravity for this entirely new kind of trading? Amsterdam turns almost overnight into Europe's new financial center, practically displacing older centers within a generation. People can finally invest directly in a company without ever having to become merchants themselves. And Amsterdam follows that breakthrough just 7 years later with something even more foundational to how the whole system works. 1609. The Whistle Bank, the Bank of Amsterdam, built specifically to solve a problem that had been quietly driving European merchants half-mad for generations. Hundreds of different coins are circulating simultaneously across Europe, clipped, worn down, and counterfeited into near total uselessness by the time they change hands for the 10th or 20th time. Merchants deposit whatever coin they happen to be holding, and the bank credits them in return with standardized bank money backed by consistently high-quality metal. Payments between customers now happen entirely through simple account transfers. No physical coin needs to move at all in the whole process. The Whistle Bank mostly avoids risky commercial lending during its early decades of operation. Does that particular caution actually pay off in the long run? Enormously. It earns the bank an extraordinary, almost unheard of level of public trust across the continent. Merchants everywhere come to genuinely prefer payment through the Whistle Bank over payment in actual circulating coin, which says quite a lot given how ancient the habit of trusting coin over paper had been up to that point. One city effectively solved Europe's entire currency chaos problem by creating a form of money people trusted more than the coins sitting in their own pockets. Not everything happening during the Dutch Golden Age proves quite that stable, though. Around this exact same era, a flower is about to become one of history's most famous financial bubbles. Between 1619 and 1637, rare tulip bulbs become objects of pure, almost giddy speculation, prices climbing higher and higher simply because buyers expect to resell them at even higher prices again tomorrow. Much of the actual trading runs on forward contracts rather than direct bank loans, but the credit and the increasingly sophisticated market sitting underneath all of it help the speculation inflate in the first place. Confidence in this entire arrangement is riding purely on the expectation that someone else will always pay more for the bulb tomorrow than you paid for it today. What actually happens the exact moment that expectation quietly breaks? Early 1637. Confidence cracks all at once, and prices fall hard and fast across the entire market. Later retellings of the story would go on to exaggerate just how catastrophic the actual fallout really was for the wider Dutch economy, but tulip mania remains one of history's earliest well-documented speculative bubbles, a flower, of all things, that became a lasting symbol of exactly what happens when optimism and easy credit run further out ahead than the underlying value can actually support. In 1656, King Charles X Gustaf grants Johan Palmstruch official permission to found Stockholm Banco. Sweden's enormous copper coins are still the core problem, some slabs weighing several kilograms apiece, requiring a cart rather than a pocket just to move your own savings from one place to another. Palmstruch's new bank takes deposits, makes loans, and goes actively looking for something lighter to solve the copper problem once and for all. In 1661, he finds it. Stockholm Banco issues Europe's first modern banknotes, paper receipts promising redemption in metal on demand, dramatically lighter and easier to carry than anything that had ever come before them. They catch on fast. Too fast, in fact. What actually happens when the paper being printed out outruns the actual metal sitting behind it in the vault? Confidence cracks, and customers rush the counter all at once, demanding metal in exchange for their paper, and the bank simply cannot cover what's being demanded. Palmstruch is removed from office and held personally, financially responsible for the shortfall. It becomes Europe's first genuine bank run built entirely on paper money. The very same brilliant invention that had solved Sweden's copper problem instantly creates Europe's very first paper money banking crisis in the exact same breath. And that crisis is precisely where every single thread running through this 5,000-year story finally meets, because Sweden's very failure is about to become the reason an entire modern financial institution exists at all. In 1668, the Swedish parliament, thoroughly chastened by Stockholm Banco's public collapse, establishes Riksständer's Bank, placed under parliamentary oversight this time around, rather than resting on one private founder's personal judgment. It will go on, in time, to become Sveriges Riksbank, the world's oldest central bank still operating in the exact same form today. The world's oldest surviving central bank exists specifically because an earlier bank failed first, and failed spectacularly enough that an entire government felt compelled to step in. Can that kind of young institution actually survive a country being invaded on every side at once? In 1672, the year the Dutch still call the rampjaar, the disaster year, the Dutch Republic is invaded simultaneously by France, England, Munster, and Cologne all at the same time. Panic spreads rapidly through Amsterdam's markets, merchants scramble desperately to protect whatever they still have, and trade slows sharply under the sheer weight of the crisis. And yet, the Bank of Amsterdam keeps functioning through every bit of it, somehow holding public confidence steady even while the country itself is under attack from 4 separate directions at once. England, meanwhile, is fighting its own expensive wars against France, and Parliament is about to build an entirely new financial engine that will go on to help build a global empire. Parliament badly needs a better way to raise money than borrowing repeatedly from any single wealthy family, the way earlier kings once leaned so heavily on the Fuggers and the Medici before them. So in 1694, Parliament formally charters the Bank of England. private investors lend money directly to the government itself in exchange for a royal charter and a set of exclusive banking privileges. What does this brand new institution actually end up controlling within just a few decades? Government debt, deposits, payments across the kingdom, eventually the exclusive right to issue banknotes throughout England. A genuine public-private hybrid unlike anything that had come before it anywhere in Europe. One that makes stable government borrowing dramatically easier and hands Britain a powerful financial engine for the wars and the imperial expansion still waiting ahead of it. England still has one final mess left over to clean up, though. Decades of clipping and shaving coins had quietly stripped much of the silver out of currency actually in circulation, and by the 1690s, the currency itself had become genuinely untrustworthy to hold. In 1696, Parliament launches the Great Recoinage, pulling every damaged coin out of circulation and replacing it with newly minted full-weight currency, with the Bank of England helping manage the considerable financial fallout of the entire transition. Expensive, disruptive to everyday commerce for months, but it restores the one single thing a functioning economy simply cannot operate without: genuine trust in the money itself. By 1700, nearly every single piece of modern banking has quietly assembled itself into place, one crisis and one invention at a time. Permanent commercial banks, government-backed banks, branch networks stretching confidently across borders, paper money, bills of exchange, deposit accounts, cashless transfers, public debt markets, double-entry ledgers. Merchants no longer need bags of gold in order to do business across an entire continent. Governments no longer need one single wealthy family's personal favor in order to fund a war. After nearly 5,000 years, after temples and clay tablets and coins first stamped in Lydia, and a slave who became a citizen, and emperors quietly bailing out panics, and an entire empire auctioned off to the highest bidder, and a family whose loans helped choose who would rule a continent, and a Swedish bank that failed specifically so a far better one could be built directly on top of the wreckage, banking finally starts looking like something we would actually recognize today. Palmstruch never lived to see what his own failure eventually made possible. The bank built directly on the wreckage of his mistake is still standing today, more than 3.5 centuries later, still doing business under the same continuous name. In the history of money, the crises never actually stopped the story from moving forward. They were the story. Every single collapse across this entire 5,000-year run, Uruk, Athens, Rome, Siena, Stockholm, happened for essentially the exact same underlying reason: people trusting a promise more than they trusted the actual thing standing behind that promise. The century arriving right after 1700 is about to run that same experiment again, at a scale nobody standing in that panicked Stockholm crowd back in 1661 could have possibly imagined. What do you think breaks it next?